My argument is we need to extend the bandwidth, not be less than intellectual, less than cognitive, but recognize the holistic nature of a Van Tillian apologetic in a way that will get traction with those students manifesting using crystals, disillusioned by the fact that they can't change the world.
This is the Future of Reformed Apologetics, a podcast from Westminster Media. Join me, Brandon McLean-Smith, and Scott Oliphant, Professor of Apologetics at Westminster Theological Seminary, as we discuss the intellectual defense of the Christian faith and how the essays in a new book Scott has edited can help us understand where we've come from and where we're going. We are children of a new time and live in a different era. In the foreword to his book, The Wonderful Works of God, Herman Bavinck made the case that the Christian confession demands theological work that, quote, takes the place of the works of the fathers and brings forth old truth in a form that corresponds with the demands of this era. If this is true for the system of Christian doctrine, how much more important is it that our defense of that faith, our apologetic, speak to our era too? Simply regurgitating pre-packaged arguments from 500 years ago just isn't going to cut it. Any apologetic approach in today's day and age has to be able to confront the unique challenges of modern unbelief. I'm Brandon McLean-Smith, and in this podcast series, we'll look at some insights from the book, The Future of Reformed Apologetics, and revisit some highlights from the 2023 conference it's based on, with Scott Oliphant, author of Covenantal Apologetics and professor of apologetics and systematic theology at Westminster.
But I hope you see where I'm going with this. My worry is dealing with the disenchanted, dealing with the remixed. If we only have a bandwidth that only deals in a kind of a high-level intellectualism, we are struggling to get traction. My argument is we need to extend the bandwidth, not be less than intellectual, less than cognitive, but recognize the holistic nature of a Van Tillian apologetic in a way that will get traction with those students manifesting using crystals, disillusioned by the fact that they can't change the world.
Strange says we have a lot of work to do on making the great lessons of Van Til accessible. And I think that your book, Covenantal Apologetics, was a huge step in the right direction there. But what more can we do to make him accessible going forward into the future?
That's good. I like what Dr. Strange says there, and I think he's right on the money. It's not enough just to repeat Van Til phrases and then think that we're done. I do think, it's one of the reasons I wanted to annotate his works, I do think clarity is needed on his phrases and explanation on his phrases to try to flesh out more what's, if I can put it this way, written between the lines of what Van Til's writing. I think that's important. But then you've got to be able to say, now, how would this apply to X in this current situation, or to Y? I'm hesitant here to talk about this, but I'm going to anyway. One of the reasons I wrote Battle Belongs to the Lord was to make Van Til's thought accessible to anybody in the pews. It's nothing but biblical material expounding Van Til's own views without ever footnoting him or mentioning him, because again, what's behind what Van Til is saying is Scripture. So I wrote that to make it accessible. I wrote Know Why You Believe, and I was told make this accessible to high school people. And again, Van Til's not mentioned in there, but I would challenge anybody who reads it to find anything in there that's inconsistent with what Van Til was saying. That was supposed to be a book to make him more accessible. Rod Mays and I wrote Things That Cannot Be Shaken. We wrote that for, Rod was in charge of RUF Ministries at that point, and we wrote that for people that he knew in college who were dealing with some of the things Dr. Strange is talking about. Again, it's thoroughly in line with what Van Til was saying. It does use his language. We don't footnote him. But it's a Van Tilian way to address, back then cutting was a big issue. So that's in the book, trying to deal with that. As you say, covenantal apologetics, the faithful apologet, all of these that I've written in that vein were meant to make Van Til accessible. Now, I can't measure the success of any of that, but I can say that that's what I've tried to do for the past 30 years. Some of the things I've written so that they're not quite as accessible because there's an audience there as well. Reasons for Faith would be an example of that. But the main books that I've published in apologetics, now I'm not talking about the annotations of Van Til's book, the books that I've published in apologetics have had that one goal. How can I make these things so that people who are in the pews, people who are in high school, people who are in college and having issues can understand much of what Van Til was after. So I think what's needed, I think Strange is right here, and Dan's doing a great job of this himself. He's got a lot of Van Til in what he does. He has a lot of J.H. Bavinck in what he does, and that's all good. Blend that and bring it together as you minister. And I think what's needed is more people like that, more people who say, I'm convinced that Van Til is in line with Reformed theology and with Scripture, but it hasn't helped over here, or we need to say more in this context of things. A good Van Tilian analysis, accessible analysis of the gender question is just begging to be done, because again, once you deny creation, which we've done with our evolution narrative, it's inevitable that things are going to spiral down to the absurdity of a gender-sex distinction, the absurdity of that. So how do you argue that? You have to argue it on the basis of, number one, what Scripture says. Number two, since Scripture says that, it's patently obvious that males are males and females are females. A Van Tilian critique needs to go there. I'm not saying it hasn't been done anywhere, but the point is, if Van Til's views are biblical, they're not going to pass away and they're not going to die out. They just need to be updated, spoken in different languages in terms of context and professional, certainly different languages around the world, but different languages in terms of philosophical ideas and professions, and put forward in that way. So I'm all for what Strange was saying. I've tried to do that myself. I hope others are working on that as well.
Although it might seem obvious, it's important to stress what the stakes are for this argument from Scripture that Scott's talking about. Unless your apologetic is useful for evangelism, it's pretty much useless. While apologists like Scott and Dan Strange have been teaching and publishing this stuff for years, it can be difficult to apply what you read in a book to a real-world conversation. So I asked Scott how to take this Reformed apologetic to the street without reading from a script. What would be a good conversation starter that you would think for apologetics and a covenantal method? I think a lot of times people use Van Til's work as like it's a script that you have to read, but really it's more of the manual. So how would you start a conversation to get to a covenantal apologetic?
You talking about start a conversation with an unbeliever?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, what I try to tell students is the best way to think about this is to be a really good listener and a really good question asker. So, for example, I have a friend, I haven't seen him in a while now, but not a Christian, and knew that I was a Christian. And, we would talk about it sort of casually and superficially, really, until one time he took a trip overseas, and the country he was in was experiencing quite a bit of pain and suffering, and so he came back to me. And this was unusual for him because he was a congenial fellow, but he really, with his finger shaking my face, he said, "Your God can't exist when there's that kind of suffering." Now, there's a conversation starter for you. And so, what do you do when someone says that? Well, there are a lot of options. I'm not saying only one. But what I did was to say, tell me how you know about my God so that there's a conflict there that you're seeing. What kind of God is it you think I believe in so that suffering has no place? And he stared at me, and I was glad. But a few weeks later, he called and said, I want to pick you up and let's go out. And so we had a nice conversation about the gospel. So what did that do? That helped him see that he was assuming, by shaking his finger in my face, that he knew the God I believed in. And I wanted the epistemological question to answer. How do you know that God? Because you don't read a Bible. I know that. So you've got an idea about the God I believe in, and all of a sudden suffering doesn't fit with that. Well, of course, he's pointing to the problem of evil, and that is something we need to address. But I needed to know the epistemological question first. So I think that that's an important thing. When Van Til says we all need to help others and ourselves become epistemologically more self-conscious, that's a sort of highbrow way to say we need to help people recognize that when they make statements, there needs to be a foundation for that statement that's beyond just, I think so. And the more we're able to do that in any kind of conversation, my wife and I know a person who's experienced, she's not a believer, she's experienced a death in her family. And, she told us one day that she saw a bluebird come and land on the tree. And it was the day, anniversary of the day that this death had happened. And she said, see, that means, he's speaking or he's there. And we're still in process with all of that. But that's a good occasion to say, why would you want to tie these things together? She's looking for meaning. How do I think about this death? Is it just through these natural events that are happening in the world? And does that mean it's all, swallowed up in a kind of naturalistic environment? And because the bluebird's there, we have some comfort. So what is that? The reason she thinks that way is because of the sensus divinitatis. She knows God, and she knows what he's like, and she's suppressing that in unrighteousness. And so she's inventing a sort of absurd contingency, importing meaning into it so that now it all of a sudden becomes a religious event for her. So I think as we have to interpret those things in light of what Scripture tells us is going on in people's minds, and then begin to ask the right questions. What I tell people is we don't ever want to start a conversation with an unbeliever and say, by the way, I know that you know God and you suppress that unrighteousness, so tell me how you do that. That's a sort of in-your-face, 3 acres of onions kind of approach. It's just going to push people away. But good listening and good questions, and then that will move us in a way that we can begin to help people understand that the gospel is preeminent here. Just to use, the example of the gender situation. If we say to someone, this is kind of the transcendental way to think about it. Now, you're in the middle of a conversation. Eventually you say to someone, well, I don't see any other option except that man and woman were created in the image of God, and therefore God set the terms and the boundaries, not only of who we are, but of what we're supposed to be like. I don't see another option. Can you tell me another one? Give me another option of how you might think living in this world is going to be meaningful for you if the man-woman thing is just completely fluid and you or your husband or your wife or your children or your aunt or your come to you one day and say, I'm going to switch. I'm going over to the other gender. You can say on the surface, well, that's okay, but you're staring at someone that was not born or assigned this particular gender. And then, see, if you do that, if you start there, then you can say, by the way, the reason I affirm creation is because this is what God has told us. And he's also told us that the reason things aren't the way they ought to be is because of the fall and the sin. So you can move so easily at that point into the gospel. And I think that's the beauty. That when I first started reading Van Til, I was involved in Young Life, which is an evangelistic ministry to high school kids. And this is what resonated with me. I can think this way, what Van Til's writing. I was trying to get my handle on a lot of it. Some of it was obscure, some of it I was getting, and I was trying to use that in my ministry and evangelism. and it all sort of fit together. And it was the first time that the only thing I'd read previous to that was Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And I thought, well, these are kind of nice if you're a Christian, but I'm not dealing in Young Life with Christians in high school. I'm dealing with non-Christians, and whatever evidence they have, they can throw it out. So I think that the reality here is this was Professor Howe's essay in Jerusalem and Athens. A long essay on how Van Til doesn't understand distinction between apologetics and evangelism, and Van Til sort of sweetly at the end said, "Yeah, you're kind of right. I don't make that distinction. We're on a continuum here. Christ is there at the beginning. It's the self-attesting Christ of Scripture when you're doing apologetics and when you're doing evangelism. And if it's seamless that way, isn't that the Reformed way? I mean, it should not be. This is over here. This is Brian Mattson's point. It's not over here in the field floating on its own, and then eventually you might have to import Christ somehow. Let's call the minister now that the theistic part's done. No, it's not that. It's Christian theism or no theism."
As Dan Strange mentioned in his lecture, one of the emerging trends in the culture is the resurgence of paganism versus atheism. I asked Scott if a Reformed apologetic could help us.
Yeah, I think Dr. Strange is very astute in the way he analyzes these things, and we need to take them very seriously. I also think there's nothing new under the sun. So whenever we have a new ism, I don't think we need a new method. We might need new vocabulary to try to get at what the new ism is. But what is paganism? It's just another form of Genesis 3. I decide who I am on my terms, no matter what God has said. That's what paganism is. Now it's going to present itself differently than atheism because it's going to look maybe more apathetic about Christianity. It might look, if today's news is any signal, it might look more militant. So you have apathy and you have militancy. And what does Van Til call that? That's just, pagan dialectic. I don't care about anything, but I sure care about this, and I'm going to march. And I think the way, you want to try to address those things is, first of all, recognize why these things are happening. It's the same reason historically that it's always been for thousands of years, because our hearts are idol factories. So people are making new idols, calling them by new names, but it's all the same. It's a man-made idol that can't fulfill what those making them want the idol to fulfill. So in the end, it's going to be meaningless, and you're going to have to move to something else. So what is the paganism? Maybe it's religion doesn't matter anymore. And if that's the case with someone, the conversation can revolve, could do other things, but can revolve around, what do you mean by religion? Do you mean strict devotion to a particular cause? If that's what you really mean, then by the way, we're both religious, and let's decide why we are that way and what we're meant to do about it. And I've told students this has happened. Yeah, when I was studying philosophy as a college student, logical positivism had just died, and it died by suicide. But my philosophy professor said when he was a university student getting his PhD, logical positivism was all the rage, and he was a Christian man. And he said, that other Christians were saying, what are we going to do? Because logical positivism has now said that religious language is meaningless. And, the point is, so what? Logical positivism will die. And then what happened was, others pointed out, by the way, guys, your own premise for your philosophy fits your description of meaninglessness because there's no empirical verifiability present for it. So it itself is meaningless. And so it killed itself. This is what philosophies do. They self-destruct. Logical positivism did. Same when I was teaching here, postmodernism was on the ascendancy, and I had students say, what do we do now that the meta-narrative is disallowed? You just can't, the incredulity of the meta-narrative. Two things. Number one, it'll die. It'll go away. Number two, says who? And if truth is a sort of relativistic thing within people groups, then whoever's saying that, it might be true in their group, but it doesn't have to be true in yours. So it can't be universally applicable if the meta-narrative is dead. What happened? Postmodernism kind of self-destruct, and at least in terms of the literature. But postmodernism is just another form of relativism, and relativism, again, it started in Genesis 3, so it's always going to be there. So I'd say paganism is another form of relativism. As best you're able, or as best one is able, learn the language and use the same method with that language in order to try to discuss with people, listen well, ask questions, and you're going to be able to move in terms of what they're, because that will self-destruct. You're going to be able to move in and show that their own views are not going to be sustainable, even on their own terms.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Future of Reformed Apologetics. Join us next week when we discuss James Anderson's essay, Van Til versus the Matrix. If you're interested in learning more about the book this show was based on, visit WTSpress.com to order a copy of The Future of Reformed Apologetics, featuring essays by K. Scott Oliphant, Christopher Watkin, Brian G. Mattson, Daniel Strange, James Anderson, Rob Edwards, David O. Filson, Nathan D. Shannon, and Vern Poitras, and published by Westminster Seminary Press. This episode was hosted by Brandon McLean Smith. It was produced by Brandon McLean Smith, Josh Curry, and Jimmy Atkins. Special thanks to Paul Queeram, Jonathan Brack, and Josiah Pettit. This podcast is a production of Westminster Media. If you enjoyed today's episode, please visit wts.edu/give to find out how you can support broadcasts and publications like this one as a part of Westminster's mission to train specialists in the Bible for the future of Christ's Church. Thank you for listening.